Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Brett Theodos. I direct our local finance and growth practice at the Urban Institute. Thanks for joining us today. I'm excited to bring forth a jam-packed session. We're going to be talking about opportunity zones, hearing from some fabulous folks who are doing some really interesting work in this space. We're going to be doing a little bit of a look back, but mostly in order to look forward on OZs. As most of you know, in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act of 2025, there were changes to the program, and one of those is the governors are going to be nominating new zones from eligible census tracts. And this is a really pivotal decision. In some ways, perhaps the most important economic development decision that governors will be making, certainly with federal resources in the next year. We really want that decision to be informed by lessons from the first iteration of opportunity zones. However, relatively little is known around where OZ investment goes nationally because of limited federal reporting requirements. Fortunately, we've been able to produce some new evidence, and there's also some nationwide evidence to bring to bear to take a look at one state that has a conforming tax incentive to try to help us understand what are the factors that governors should be weighing as they think through those selections. So we've analyzed where OZ dollars are flowing and what those trends say about the OZ program and what lessons governors can keep in mind. If you're on this call and you're not a governor, we still think the insights in the data and the conversation to follow will be valuable. So in the last round, cities and county executives had some influence. Indeed, in some cases, even actually made the selection nominations themselves. And certainly NGOs, CDFIs, CDCs, other nonprofit developers, banks, and others can attempt to influence governor decisions in positive and productive ways. So hope that even if you're not a governor, you're taking good notes and thinking about how to engage productively with your state in its decision-making process. So our agenda today is in three parts. We'll have a data presentation. We will have an industry panel. We will have a local leader panel who can help bring all of these things together. Couple of housekeeping items. The event is being recorded and the recording will be posted online, so you can rewatch it as many times as you want. Or if you have to drop off, you can catch it or forward it on to colleagues. Speaker bios and slides are online, as are links to the publications and the data resource that we'll be referencing. You can type your questions into the Q&A box. We will fold them into our discussion along the way. Okay, so we're going to get going with a bit of analysis in terms of stage setting and then have our conversation. This is joint work with colleagues here at the Urban Institute, Brady, Alina, and Tomi. And the research part of it was funded specifically by Arnold Ventures. Thank you to them. Okay, so a couple of caveats before we get going. First, we're presenting data for one state because that's where we had transaction level information. We need better federal data about where this incentive is going. We'll leave it at that for the moment. Second caveat is we really are talking about opportunity zones 1.0, and there have been some material changes to how OZs are rolling forward, especially for rural tracts. That said, I've taken to referring to the latest iteration of opportunity zones as version 1.1, not version 2.0, because while there is certainly change from the first version, it is not whole cloth change that will result in fundamentally different expectations for the program going forward. So it's still instructive to look at how the program has been used in the past over time. Okay, so here is a look at tracts in Ohio and where that investment was going. And again, we're going to draw this forward to be of application to the whole US in just a minute here. A couple of data caveats. One, these are folks getting the state conforming incentives. So in theory, people could have gotten the federal one without the state one, so could be missing some projects. Also, not all years of data are available. So I would not get too attached to the numbers that are here, but I would try to absorb the percents or the shares that we're talking about, especially. So if we think about that blue circle, those were tracts in Ohio that were designated, those 328 tracts. Of those initially designated, a third got investment. So one important theme that you'll be hearing throughout this is coming back to the Kevin Costner reference here. This is not a field of dreams. If you build it, he will come sort of program, right? There are lots of tracts that got designated in the first round that did not get any investment. And we'll talk about the nature of the tracts that did and that not. But important to keep in mind when we're thinking about what we're selecting in terms of tracts, that many tracts have been passed by without investment. Okay, so a third of the tracts, that's the green there, have indeed gotten investment. Really interesting to note, a good number of investments went into tracts that were not designated. Now, the program allows a certain share of that investment to happen outside of zones. And this is a higher share than the program allows. So in theory, people could be balancing that out with a nationwide strategy and putting it in other states. In theory, the data could just be wrong as they're being entered either by the investor or captured by the state. Or maybe there's fraudulent activity that's getting claimed. We don't know. But all that to say, we can't miss the fact that a good amount of OZ investment is actually happening not in zones. So that's important to keep in mind even when we're thinking about selections that are happening. Okay. Now, when we think about not just the 33% of original zones designated or the additional investment going to tracts that weren't, but really what share of investment goes to what share of tracts, we see an incredible skewing of investment activity. So, for example, 9 designated tracts with the most investment are representing a lot of the total investment that we're seeing. So each of these, you can see this is a single tract, this is a single tract, another. So, for example, these 2 tracts are more than all of these other 319 put together. And certainly this one non-designated tract is more than many of the designated tracts that got investment, not to mention those that didn't. So in addition to not necessarily getting OZ investment, it's important to keep in mind that the share, the size of that investment can be very different in the type of tract that we're talking about. Of course, that reflects investor preferences. It also reflects underlying land value, potentially other capital sources that are folding into that project or around that project. There's a lot going on. So this just to say the amounts of capital coming into a place vary quite a bit, and there's a real skew to that distribution. When we drill in a little bit more and look at it geographically, there are also some interesting stories that exist. So we're comparing share of investment to population in the place. So for example, what we see is a penalty to being rural. So there's a diminishment of investment relative to population in rural areas, or what could be expected on a pro rata share. Interestingly, that is also true for micropolitan statistical areas. So these smaller cities really also had very much a penalty to investment. There's long-standing reasons for that, which are much bigger than the Opportunity Zone program, but they do also reflect on the underlying incentive that really prioritizes appreciation in the OZ program. Of course, in the latest version, rural areas will have some extra preferences built in. So one thing to watch is how that will be changing over time. But it doesn't mean that because investment went underperformed in rural or micro areas, that metro areas were definitively better off either. So we can see Akron, Cincy, Dayton, Toledo, Youngstown are also all underperforming in terms of investment share. And where is not? Cleveland, especially, and in terms of dollars, but not projects. So we had some very big industrial projects there. And then also in terms of Columbus, with really a lot of projects folding in. So those are areas that have seen that level of economic activity. What about the types of projects this will support? And you may be asking why this is important for zone selection, but it is very important for zone selection because this reflects underlying land uses. And how land is zoned will affect what land is used for, will affect whether it's attractive to OZ capital, and will mean and have implications for whether a zone should or shouldn't be selected. So what we see is nearly 2/3 of OZ projects supported residential activity, either only residential or with mixed use as well. So we really have not had nationwide data that answers this question in any helpful or very clear representative way. But interestingly, this does confirm in a way what we're seeing. While opportunity zones were initially anticipated to be an economic development program, in many ways they are actually accomplishing more investment into the housing space. And so that is important. But it also, we see projects that are commercial or are industrial in use and some other types as well. So important to keep in mind. Interestingly, we do see single family. Keeping in mind single family is inclusive of 1 to 4 unit buildings. So these could be investor owned smaller rental properties or even truly single family kind of solo properties. Okay, and the last thing that we wanted to add in terms of the data, and I'm going to pass it to my colleague Brady to talk about a tool, is we also went ahead and looked up what the rents were for the properties that were being produced. So that can help governors and other advocates and local leaders to think through what type of housing will be built. And so we related the rents of the housing that is being built through OZs to the median rent of the community where it is going located. And you'll see is very few of these are in the more deeply affordable space. We are much more in the over 120% of the area median rent, or especially over that plus the over 100% of area median rent. So we really are talking about more market rate, or even relative to the tract, if not the AMI, above the market supported rents at present in the tract. Okay, Brady.
Thanks, Brett. So now turning from Ohio, we use these findings to create a tool that we hope can inform the next set of governor's opportunity zone selections. So in the first round, some opportunity zones had substantial economic need, but failed to attract investment because the incentive was not sufficient to motivate investors to move capital into them. Other OZs received substantial investment, but didn't demonstrate much need. So for selecting OZs in the second round, we believe the governors can strive to identify Goldilocks tracks, those tracks that have a reasonable shot of attracting OZ capital and also have need. So to inform these selections, based on the Ohio OZ data, which Brett just spoke about, we were able to construct a model of which census tracts are more likely and which are less likely to receive OZ investment. We then also categorized which tracts may likely receive substantial investment but don't demonstrate the need for the incentive. And our model is based on economic and population characteristics for these census tracts. So, of course, it's missing important local context and knowledge. So we hope that this tool can be used as a framework that's paired with on-the-ground knowledge of local place-based economic development strategies and land use patterns to inform these decision-making processes. So we published this data as a spreadsheet. So it's available at the event page, which link you can find in the chat here. So you can look more closely at your respective geographies. But I wanted to take the opportunity today to walk through the components of our tool, how it's made up, and then to finally show you a few example maps of how this plays out in various geographies. So looking at which Ohio OZs attracted OZ investment in the first round, we found that 6 indicators stood out. First, we have the aggregate capital that's flowing into these communities prior to OZ designation. And this is the most predictive measure in Ohio, and therefore we've weighed this doubly in our model. Then we have percentage change across 6 metrics leading up to point of designation. We've got multifamily residential capital flows, total jobs, median household income, median rent, and population. And again, that's percent change across all those metrics. So you're seeing kind of that on the housing side, the appreciation come into play there. We looked at where census tracts fell on these measures compared to all eligible tracts. So, for OZs, so where they're competing against for investments, to sort them into more likely or less likely categories. We considered a tract to be already capable of attracting capital without the added OZ incentive needed if it fell above the 90th percentile nationally. And we're not talking here just about eligible tracts. This is among every census tract in the United States. So it's top 10% of the country in any of these categories. And those are aggregate capital, median household income, median rent, or median home value. Additionally, as college students often make areas appear economically distressed, even when they're not, so much as the college students are showing up as having low incomes, we added tracts to this category that had a greater than 15% population aged 18 to 24. This, again, is where hopefully local context can inform. If a college area tract is truly in need of market acceleration, then governors can still consider it. All right, so moving on to a few maps, so you can see how these classifications look in various places. So to orient you, we've colored green those Goldilocks tracts that can attract OZ investment and still have impact. We've shaded yellow those tracts that likely have significant need, but unfortunately the OZ program is less structured to effectively support. And finally, we've colored magenta those tracts that likely do not need OZ designation to attract capital. So first up, we've got Chicago. You'll note large sections of the south side have significant need, but many of these tracts are shaded yellow, as even with OZ designation, they would still struggle to attract private capital. However, there are pockets of green here where the added OZ incentive could make a difference and therefore could be worth focusing on. Other areas with enough market activity for OZs to make a difference, you can see on the west side, Bridgeport, Humboldt Park. And then I also wanted to point out here, if you look north of the city in magenta, you'll see one of those college tracts we talked about that's around Northwestern University, and Evanston is not a particularly disinvested community. So that's how that's playing out in our tool. Next up here, we've got West Virginia, where you can see how the tool looks amidst some rural areas and more disinvested communities. So you'll first note that there is very little magenta on this map. Most notably, you see it around West Virginia University. And there's a lot of yellow that's showing areas that have need but are less likely to draw OZ investment. Some of the areas that are most primed for OZs are around the capital city, Charleston, Beckley in the southern part of the state, and in Jefferson County in the eastern panhandle, to name a few. And then finally, we looked at a hotter market area with Brooklyn in New York City. So you can see the more highly invested areas in North Brooklyn around Greenpoint, Williamsburg, right on the water. They're already drawing market investment. They're highly capitalized, and that's why they're shaded magenta for not needing that additional added incentive. In contrast, you see concentrations of green where OZs could drive investment in areas like East New York, Brownsville, and Coney Island. And with that, I'm going to pass the microphone over to David Wessel, the director of the Hutchins Center on Fiscal and Monetary Policy at the Brookings Institution, to start our first panel discussion.
Thank you. I'm having trouble turning on my camera, but I'm here. Here we go. Thanks very much, Brady and Brent. Really pleased to have a great panel of practitioners to join us today. It's a great ratio. 3 people who actually invest money on 1 lawyer, which I think should be the standard, never more than 1 lawyer and 4 for every panel. But it's particularly a lawyer with particular interest in this. So the panelists are Jim Castleberry, who's co-founder and CEO of Known Holdings LLC, which is a coalition of investors and others, mission-driven investment. Before that, he was chief investment officer at a family office that did quite a bit of social impact investing, including some OZ projects. Jacques Logan is the senior vice president of new business initiatives for the National Equity Fund, which is a nonprofit outfit that facilitates and invests in multifamily affordable housing. And Kevin Rogers is senior vice president and community development lending investment manager You must have a large business card for PNC, Community Development Banking. PNC has been one of the banks that's been most active in the OZ space. And then, fortunately, we have Andrew Gradman, who's a tax attorney in LA, who's done a lot of work with people investing in OZs, but also has written quite a bit about the program. So I want to start with each of the non-lawyers for a minute and ask you to describe one project that you've done with OZs and why that project in that particular place. And Jim, maybe I can start with you.
Hey, David. Well, thank you. You know, we talked about several of them, but the one that I had decided to talk about is what we did down in North Carolina with a group called Partners in Equity. They had come up with a program of using SBA 504 loans. And just quickly, SBA 504 loan program allows entrepreneurs to use that investment to own their principal place of business. And it's one of the most successful that's used across the country, but it's also one of the ones that is the least used by Black and brown entrepreneurs because they don't have the same collateral or balance sheet to be able to do it. So the program that we did is we created a program to invest in these properties, provide the equity or the friends and family money, so the entrepreneurs would be able to buy their principal place or expand. We did that. Excuse me? I'm sorry, I'm not hearing you, David. Is it just me not hearing David?
Do you hear me?
I hear you now.
Pick that particular community.
Excuse me? I'm sorry. Maybe I need to let mine.
David, I think we're having issues with your audio all of a sudden. Why don't we could give it a moment for David to
How about
exit.
hear me now?
Yes.
There we go.
Who knows?
I hear you.
All right.
Okay.
The question is, why did you pick that particular community?
Because of the impact that it was going to be able to make within the Durham, Raleigh area. It was in an OZ. It fit with what we were looking for OZ investments. For us, we were looking to mitigate and defer tax liability, which is a big deal for a foundation that starts for a foundation and a family office that started with the tax liability of about $60 million every year. So anything that we could do to defer that or to lower that was a big deal for us. And then it also aligned with our mission of investing in Black and brown businesses and entrepreneurs. And, you know, just quickly going to our results is that we were able to literally watch the transformation of neighborhoods and the growth of the businesses kind of across the board. Just what had been a blighted block turned into a just literally a catalyst for the rest of the neighborhood.
Right. So I think what's interesting about that, two things come to mind. One is the purpose of opportunity zones, at least as described by the IRS, since there is no purpose described in the legislation, is to spur economic growth and job creation while providing tax benefits to investors. And this project is a good example, I think, of opportunity zones being used for that stated purpose, as opposed to it's not required to use it for that purpose, and we know some didn't. And secondly, I think what makes this unusual is, as Brent said, in the national data suggests a lot of the investment, not only in Ohio, went to housing. That wasn't the original idea. May have turned out maybe we need housing. It's not saying it's a bad idea, but it's interesting that you went with it strictly with what the stated purpose was. So Jacques, you want to tell us about one of your, I'm sorry, Jim, did you want to?
Yeah, just one thing I wanted to add, David, is we did probably about 20 opportunity zone investments. 16 of them were non-housing.
Right.
Really-
That makes you
really-
unusual, I think, in this space. Jack, tell us about one of your projects.
Yeah, happy to, David. NEF got involved early in OZs when they first came out, and we had two fund vehicles targeted at OZs. I picked one in Ohio because I thought it would relay well with Brett's presentation. It was a 163 unit multifamily property in the Over the Rhine neighborhood in Cincinnati with about 20,000 square feet in commercial layered into the property. As typical in affordable housing, there was a lot of complexity to it. The property was divided into sort of three separate condos. One of the condos was a LIHTC condo that brought a lot of affordability to the neighborhood.
Low-income housing tax credit.
Thank you. The other two condos involved OZ capital and a mix of new market tax credits and historic tax credits. It was spread over about 20 different parcels. And by and large, a very successful investment done with a wonderful development team, as well as a bank OZ investor that came along with us. So a very successful property or project for us. And I think it, just sort of illustrates to me the layer cake of sources relative to affordable housing to get this built. And I believe it is serving the neighborhood of Over the Rhine very well.
Thank you. Kevin?
Thanks, David. PNC Bank, we're obviously a CRA motivated investor. And during the first
Community Renewal Act.
Right. Community Investment, Reinvestment
Act, sorry.
Right. We financed 17 projects in round one. Total development cost was $300 million. We've put in $160 million of equity into those projects. And our model also brings debt alongside the equity, because the debt gives us the first lien position on the building and it protects our equity. So we created 965 units of housing and 285,000 square feet of But every transaction, or commercial space, I'm sorry, every transaction that we did though met the definition of community development per the CRA. So it was affordable housing, it was revitalization, stabilization of a low-income community, economic development, or community service. So we, hold ourselves to the criteria that it must be CRA eligible, and that, so you won't find any self-storage units in our portfolio. The project that I'd like to talk about is the Store and Pfister building in Scranton, Pennsylvania. It was is a conversion from office to residential. It created 65 units of housing and 8,000 square feet of first floor retail. I'd like to talk about the but-fors, right? Why did we do this project? In the but-for opportunity zones, this project would not have happened. The appraised value of the as stabilized appraised value was $12 million, and the project was costing $14 million to complete. So it obviously needed additional equity to come into the project to make a cash flow. The developer was able to secure historic tax credits, so we were able to twin historic tax credits with opportunity zones. And the bank brought in its own equity directly into the project, and again provided a loan, and the developer brought in the balance of the funds. But if you look at the cash flow, like our equity requires a preferred return, a very discounted rate. Is 3 to 5% interest only structure for 10 years. So that, along with our debt, it made the cash flow of the project much more feasible, and it was able to pencil out. And so we're very proud of all the work that we've done, in particular this one project in Scranton, Pennsylvania.
So just to be clear, somebody asked about this. The opportunity zone incentive is for equity. You can have debt on the side, and I bet all these projects have debt on the side, but the tax incentive is only for equity. It makes it different than some other programs.
For sure, you do have to pass a true equity test.
Right, right. So, Andrew, you know that, as Brett pointed out, very few of these zones in Ohio got most of the data. I think we know from what available national data there is that last I saw from some Treasury economists, about 2/3 of the zones got some investment. But across the country, some zones got a lot more money and some just got one project. So I'm wondering how you reflect on this advice that Urban is giving to governors to pick the Goldilocks zones, the ones where it really makes a difference, but actually someone will actually come and invest.
Yeah, I find that message about Goldilocks being the message to be interesting, and I looked at the data as as an example in the Ohio data. 2% of zones get 60% of investment, 67% get no investment at all. You referred to, I think, about the Kennedy Wheeler paper, which similar. The way I think of those numbers is, on the one hand, it's pretty skewed, but maybe on the other hand, the way to think of it is it's not as skewed as it could be. And that's where we get the balancing act. Why is it skewed? The most obvious explanation is because investors can choose between zones. They can choose not to invest in zones at all. So states need to compete for investment against other states. The zones within a state need to compete with non-zones within that state. I like to say that opportunity zones are like trail mix. If you lay out a bowl, you'll find after a while that all the M&Ms get eaten, the peanuts don't really get eaten. And if your policy was to get peanuts to be eaten, laying out a bowl of M&Ms is okay. Let's try. Okay, not the best. But the other point, which I think is also reflected in these papers, is that could be more skewed. And so why is that? Apparently, there are some other factors which make investors willing to invest in a particular zone, even if there are better zones somewhere else. I can't speak to data, but I can speak to my personal experience. One that comes to mind is that many investors and developers are only willing to work in the markets or regions where they have business experience, personal experience. So if you put an opportunity zone in a thriving neighborhood in the downtown of an urban area, or if you don't do that, but your neighboring state does do that, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is going to be a cannibalization of investment from the smaller urban or rural area, because investors who live in that rural area or in the vicinity of it will always have comfort investing in their backyards.
Yeah. So I think people, I can see from the questions, have a hard time understanding why it is that the urban tool suggests that the communities that are the worst off, the ones that have the most poor people, which have no capital, should not be designated by governors, or they're advising against that, barring some local context. And I think their argument is that those places just aren't going, the incentive isn't great enough to get people to invest in those communities. And I wondered, Jacques or Jim or Kevin, could you talk a little bit about that? Are there some communities which, as much as we would like to help them, simply are not in a position to be an incentive for private investors, given the size of the OZ incentive? Someone want to take that? I'll cold call if no one volunteers.
No, I'll take that, David. From my perspective is, the whole OZ program for us was a tool, for us to be able to work to, one, meet our investment goals, but also for us to meet our managing tax liability, but also moving forward our mission and our values. So for us, it was more of, we would look at something that we were doing and, oh, it's in an OZ zone. So we're going to structure it within the guidelines that will make sense for us, and we'll be able to have those attributes. We participated in a lot of the groups that were around Chicago in, trying to build and develop the policy. I think that the best way to think about it, and the most practical way to think about it, is to have other attributes that go with it, where the OZ component of it could make it attractive for CRA investment, could make it attractive for family office, or for other investors that use OZs as a tool, and look at those past, excuse me for offending anybody, but the normal real estate housing investors that are just using it in not necessarily in what was intended, but in the easiest way to do it, and the easiest way to be able to take advantage of it. But I do think that continuing it and to have the information out will bring other investors, now that we've actually created models where, you know, all of our, I don't think we have one OZ investment that's in the toity. I mean, all of our OZ investments that we did over 20 are performing well.
Well, that's because you don't take enough risk, Jim. I mean, I just want to, I think I understand what you're saying. Let me just reframe it. There are communities that could definitely use investment, and OZs may be a tool to get investment there, but only if there are other conditions that will supplement the OZ incentive. It might be,
Yes.
in Kevin's case, a CRA credit, or as Andrew says, some local wealthy person who wants to build his or her community. I think that's been the case in Erie, Pennsylvania, which I've looked at.
So no pun intended, but you're looking for tracks that have an opportunity for growth. You're not
Right.
You're not going to attract an investor into the poorest communities that have no opportunity, unfortunately.
Right.
So you are looking for areas that have, there's an infrastructure in place. There's, in our case, there are, we're creating a neighborhood in downtown Scranton that is going to have economic stimulus for people walking the streets and attending, frequenting the restaurants and bars and things like that.
Yeah.
Grocery
So,
stores.
Jock, what would you, given your experience, what would you advise governors when they're trying to decide among the eligible census tracts? In general, governors will be able to designate a quarter of them as OZs. And this time around, the governors will have some experience. The last time it was kind of sprung on them. So hopefully they'll make better decisions, or at least more thoughtful decisions. And I'm wondering what you've learned that you think would be useful for them to know.
Yeah, thanks, David. We've put some thought into this, and I'd put it in sort of three different buckets. As you alluded to, not a lot of time the last go round for governors to think this through. This time we have the advantage of time, and so I think about the process, where governors should engage with the local officials, and the local officials should push down and engage other community stakeholders to develop a transparent process, so that it is fully informed from sort of the ground up to the governor's office. Second, really sort of coming alongside of Kevin and Jim, the OZs need to have solid fundamentals, solid real estate fundamentals. I'm in the real estate game, not the business one. And so we need zones that are, to use Kevin's word, that have an opportunity, and not zones that even with the but-for test couldn't draw in any investment. And then the last piece, which I think is really certainly key to affordable housing, is that the local city officials should think about what other resources they can bring to bear inside of those zones to make the zones that are selected more likely to actually have transformation.
There are some questions online about the urban model and why it works the way it is. And I'm going to let the urban people decide whether to answer those online or answer those at the end, because we don't have any of them on this thing. So, Andrew, when you deal with investors who are interested in OZ projects, do you find that some of them are just, I want to find not the Goldilocks ones, but the ones that that the urban map shows is basically they don't really need the money. They're already doing really well. So it's a great place to put your money, and the OZ thing is icing on the cake? Or do you find that the investors actually are more interested in the Goldilocks zones, or does it depend on who the investors are?
You see a little of both. I would say, one thing that's nice is that investors are excited to participate in a program that theoretically they're told is helping, solve problems. I take them though as economic actors, and a rational economic actor trying to maximize their income. I think some people have the ability to arbitrage between communities and towns, and I've worked with some of those. But other people, they find a place that, and then after they find it, they determine that it's an opportunity zone. They get excited. They come to me. They ask, "What does that mean?" And then in the course of doing that, maybe they find that that is the thing that makes it possible for them to have the capital stack needed to develop it. Um, I think, to bring the point home, I think we don't know from data perspective how many investments are being made anyway versus
Right.
versus how many are being motivated by the incentive. I think that's one of the elusive questions that always needs to be answered.
Yeah, it's interesting about the CRA stuff is that they have to kind of make some justification. So as Brent mentioned at the beginning, one of the changes in the statute is to provide extra benefits if you invest in what are defined as rural areas. Best we can tell, most of the investment in OZ investment went to relatively urban or rent to urban areas. There's a strong political interest to help rural areas. Of course, some of the rural areas probably their problem is not enough real estate, but too much real estate. But I'm just curious whether you think the changes in the law will be a significant incentive to direct more OZ investment to rural areas. Kevin, do you have any thoughts on
Sure.
that? Or yeah,
Sure. The 30% add-on basis I think is beneficial. A problem in rural areas is they don't have the scale. So you're not going to build a 300 apartment building in a rural area because you'll never fill it. So I think that's one reason why the urban areas have been more successful, because you have a market, a stronger market. Because these deals are not cheap to structure and close. The legal expenses are more than a typical debt structure would be. But I do like, one of the projects we did was in Wheeling, West Virginia, and we picked that specifically because it was deemed to be a rural area. And I'm from a small town that doesn't get a whole lot of LIHTC opportunities or new market tax credit opportunities. So I think that this might be a way of getting investment into some of the smaller areas with the 30% additional add-on basis, and the substantial improvement test being reduced to 50%, where some of these old buildings that have been vacant for a while, can be converted into, be brought back to life.
why don't you just explain the substantial improvement test and how it changed for rural?
Right. On one point, on the first version of BOP zones, there was a substantial improvement test where you had to invest $1 more in renovating the building than you did on purchasing the building. So if you bought it for $1 million, you had to spend at least $1.1 million in rehabilitation expenses to bring it back, to revitalize it. Under the new rule, if it's deemed to be a rural area, you only have to spend $500,000 on that $1 million purchase. So it's a little bit easier, and it would require less of an investment in terms of renovation.
The Wheeling one you mentioned, is that because of the new incentive, or this before?
It was before.
I
It was
see.
before.
Okay.
But we do, there is a soft spot in my heart for rural areas.
I see. So the seeker is not a bigger tax incentive. The seeker is to have a rural guy in your bank.
That's right. That's right.
Jim?
David,
Yeah.
David, currently looking at a couple of rural deals, and they're different. One is an agricultural play that we're looking at. The other one is workforce housing, for where there has been development of different manufacturing and logistic areas to be where there's no housing that's within a serviceable area. So those are two things, again, that kind of go along the lines of the driver is another need. The tool is the opportunity zone for the investor that can leverage that opportunity to be able to move forward with it. So we are, I'm really interested in the ag deal is looking to be pretty compelling. And, you know, with a lot of different farmers right now that are trying to find different ways to be able to, for land use and stuff like that. It's, it's compelling. It's interesting. I don't have the results of it yet, but to me, it's an interesting opportunity.
And does the extra incentive in Opportunity Zones 1.1 make a difference there, do you think?
Yes.
Yeah. Andrew, you've talked in our previous conversation a little bit about governors have to be careful not to create too many hoops that discourage OZ investment. But I'm wondering about the opposite. Do you see any evidence that these state incentives, like the ones that Ohio has to basically, the DC has one as well, I believe, that supplement, you get an extra tax break from the local government or the state government. Does that make a big difference, or is that just one more bit of icing on the cake?
I don't have a lot to say about that, but I can tell you just anecdotally that people are looking not just at how the states do the OZ incentive, but other incentives. One that has come up
Right.
a lot is New York having a brownfields. I have a friend who, a client who loves to do his OZ deals in New York and take advantage of that. So I would just say certainly people are looking at all of the different incentives that are out there.
I see. Okay. I'm just looking through the questions. We've hit a lot of them. One question is, the answers have community development financial institutions played a big role in OZs. Do any of you have experience with that?
Yeah. We did a deal with IFF in Chicago on a building that was owned by Chicago Workforce Development, and we did that deal with IFF in Chicago. And
IFF is a CDFI.
yes.
Yeah.
David, we work a lot with CDFIs and mission-driven developers who make up by and large the core of our developer pool, and we're actively engaging with them. And you know, sort of on the whole, at the moment, you know, OZs and a lot of the existing federal housing programs to create affordable housing don't seem to line up all that well. And I think there's a lot of work being done now, both here at NEF and our parent LISC, as well as through other sort of stakeholder groups, to see if we can get some changes on the margins made, either statutory or through the regulatory channels, to get OZs to align a little better with some of the other federal housing programs. So hopefully CDFIs can really benefit on the housing front.
Yeah. Most CDFIs are nonprofits, so they don't have capital gains. They have the tax incentives really are moot to them. So we would love to have CDFIs come in as a sub debt lender in our program or our projects, but the benefits of BOP zones really don't play well for, you know, CDFIs. There's no benefit for them.
Right. Right.
David, can I
Andrew?
follow up on your question about state incentives?
Please.
Because I'm thinking about this now and thinking it is important for listeners to make a distinction whether an incentive is directed at the investor or directed at the project. And I say this because, you know, here in California, if a California person invests out of state into another state with an incentive, California will still tax them on their income, regardless of what that state may have to say about investments. It's because they're a California taxpayer. So that's a loss. That's an inability for the other state to attract the California investor, unless they make the project, the tax incentive not be adhere to the individual investor, but be something that's given to the project. So just keeping in
Right.
mind how you're going to attract the California and the New York investor in that setting.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
I would also add to, like, what states could do is maybe have a set aside that if you're getting some state benefit out of the program, like in Ohio, then maybe you require a certain percentage of the units to be set aside for affordable, or local governments could provide tax benefits, like real estate tax benefits for a number of units being set aside for affordable, and create some mixed income properties. I think that's a
Interesting.
healthier project.
All right. So we have a few minutes left, and I want to ask each of you you may be repeating something you said already, but given we know that the governors are going to have to be choosing zones, and as Jacques said, they have a lot more time and information this time. If I want each of you to say, what message do you think it's most important for the governors and their offices to keep in mind as they make these selections this time around? Maybe I'll start with you, Jim.
Well, I think the main thing is, David, is that the zones that they select have the components that are needed to be able to attract the investors to them. Not that they have to have all of them, but to be able to have the underlying infrastructure and the components that will allow them to be able to utilize the OZ opportunity to be beneficial versus having to devote too much cost and money to bring it up to the level where they can consider an investment. That some
Right.
of that is already there. And if it's not there, that they have programs that are aligned in the same way to be able to move that forward.
Right. I guess some people worry that the alternative is they'll put it in places that are already gentrifying, which will be great investments opportunities, but the incentive may not have the desired social impact. Jacques, what would you tell governors?
Yeah, I think, coming at it from solely the affordable housing lens here, and knowing that affordable housing is really contingent, or proliferation of affordable housing is contingent on making some of these statutory or regulatory suggestions or changes that we've suggested. I'd really lean back on process and say just take advantage of the time, run a transparent process that really sums up all of the stakeholder comments, and then steer local resources to get the affordable housing that we hear all throughout the country is needed.
Thanks. Kevin?
I love the idea of making affordable housing a key component of op zones. It will never replace LIHTC, because your repayment source of a LIHTC deal are tax credits, and your repayment source of an opportunity zone deal is cash flow from the project. But things that when you're looking to identify the right census tracts, again, look for those that have opportunity, not necessarily gentrification. I would talk with the community, find out what they need. Do they want the investment, or do they want the designation? Because it's important that you're facilitating projects that the community wants and needs. So communication is critical.
Always, yeah.
As the lawyer, I'm going to take the cynical view. I'll start by saying you should be very clear about what your goals are, because opportunity zones can do many different things. In the most extreme version of this, you put all the zones in places where investments already going to be made and benefits no public purpose. Well, you've still brought federal money into your state. And I'm not here to tell you can't have that be your policy, but you should decide whether that's your policy or whether you want there to be more, and then you should be clear about what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, and I think you pointed out, it's not simple because you have to think about what the other states around you are doing. And if you pick unattractive zones and they pick attractive zones, you may get a lot of blue ribbons from the advocacy community and no money, and all the money will go to the other people.
Exactly.
That happened inside states. There are some cities in Pennsylvania that attracted a lot of investment, and other cities didn't because of the zones that they picked.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, I think we're at time. I want to thank all four of you for really useful comments. And I think there are a lot of unanswered questions and we'll try and get especially the specific ones answered along the way. And I want to turn things back over to Brett.
Thanks so much to our industry panel. Super appreciate your all's expertise and insights. I'm realizing as the questions are coming through that we have people at very different points in their OZ learning journey. And so I just want to do one split second, try to get folks up to speed. So the biggest way that opportunity zone incentive is profitable for projects is by the exclusion, getting out of paying capital gains tax when your investment in some property, often, right, not an operating business most of the time, appreciates. And so when we're talking about whether it makes sense to invest in a zone, we're really talking about the fundamentals of the opportunity zone tax incentive as opposed to a tax credit like the low-income housing tax credit or the new market tax credit, where you can count on that credit paying for the project. It's really the appreciation that is the biggest driver here. And so that is why, that is the most fundamental reason why we see investment going into some zones and not into other zones. In fact, one of the most predictive signs of where we saw investment going in Ohio, and this is why it's important to really model this correctly, is zones that were already on the appreciation on-ramp in a pretty significant way, even before the incentive took off. And so that really is what's going to be most attractive to most investors under this program. Okay, I want to bring in our second panel, now that we're all level set. Actually, sorry, one more level set, the step up in basis. So it's not, the only dimension that we are talking about for rural is not the substantial improvement test, but also the step up in basis. So going from the 10% to the 30%. So that's a pretty important factor to consider when we're thinking about rural areas and differences in this current version of OZs. Okay, want to bring in our city leaders and have a discussion reflecting on what local priorities should be and how localities should begin to advocate for, or even actually go further than that and do selection of zones. So we'll do the personal intros kind of in background naturally as we talk through some of our answers, but thank you both for joining us. So let's just jump right in, and Sharon, we'll start with you, and then that's a little bit of a different case, and then Anne will go over to a little bit more typical case, I think. So Sharon, how did local governments think through identifying, recommending, or in your case, selecting tracks in opportunity zones in the last go round?
Sure. So Sharon Carney, I'm with HRNA Advisors, but back in 2017, 2018, I was working in the mayor's office in Washington, D.C. And fortunately or unfortunately, we were treated as a state in opportunity zone selection. So the mayor was able to nominate tracks, and I was like that one person probably sitting around between Christmas and New Year's at the end of 2017 and somehow got selected as the OZ person. And so I really spearheaded the process for track selection and local implementation of the policy. So what did we consider? I would say three main things in track selection. First was need, as we've talked a little bit about on the prior panel and in the questions. So, you know, is this an area, a census tract that needs investment? Baseline, is it there? And in some cases, you know, we saw, as Brady said, there's some universities that are showing a tract as eligible, but we knew that didn't need to be considered, so we took those out. Second big thing we considered was utility. Back in 2017, 2018, we were anticipating that this would be an opportunity for operating businesses to raise capital that they needed. And so we were really thinking a lot about the commercial elements. We were also thinking about commercial real estate, of course, and mixed use development. But we were really trying to think about those areas where potentially an operating business could tap into this resource. And so we looked at land use, we looked at zoning, we looked at areas where there was already some commercial density or some places where we were already trying to address those objectives. And then third big category is impact. So, because it's a competitive tool, it's, this is not a community development program. This is not something that requires actual outcomes. This is just about investment. We really wanted to think about where real impact could happen. And so to do that, we were thinking about real projects, namely real projects within the district's portfolio, because those are projects where we could require that there were benefits. We could require more transparency than the average development. And so that was a big piece of our thought process too.
Anne.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Anne Bovaird-Nevins with Accelerator for America, but very similar to Sharon, back when the Opportunity Zones incentive was passed, I worked for an organization called PIDC, which is the Economic and Community Development Corporation for the City of Philadelphia. So in that role, I was part of the team that was tasked with assessing this new OZ incentive and supporting the identification of census tracts that should be designated for OZ investment. And as I think Brett noted, our more typical case, we in Philadelphia were really simply making a recommendation or request to the governor of Pennsylvania rather than having the ability to designate those tracts ourselves. So the first thing that I would probably just note right off the bat, especially given some of the questions that are popping up in the chat, is speaking from that local economic and community development perspective. If we had had a magic wand to wave, this was not the incentive that we would have designed from that local perspective to meet the community needs in most of Philadelphia's eligible census tracts. So I think the first thing that we did in terms of how did that inform our tract selection was to really look at where had we already planned and analyzed the strategies that could drive inclusive growth within Philadelphia. The city had relatively recently released a comprehensive long-term plan called Philadelphia 2035, was actively developing a citywide transportation plan and a citywide housing action plan, all of which had place-based components. So we really looked at the OZ eligible census tracts as an overlay on those existing plans, rather than something from which to start a new planning process from scratch. At the same time, we were also really trying to get ourselves up to speed. Again, as Sharon mentioned, there was a lot that we didn't know about how OZ investment was going to play out. But even with that limited information, the working theory was that OZs alone were not going to play a major gap filling role in those hardest to serve markets and projects, and would be more likely to increase investment on the margins in the areas that were already showing some level of market strength. But we didn't know what we didn't know. And so we also had a theory that opportunity zones could be paired with other types of incentives like new markets tax credits, like LIHTC, like CDBG funding, some of which was talked about in the last session. And being able to layer opportunity zones into a capital stack of a more challenging project in communities across the city was something that we also wanted to take into account and be able to ensure some balance. And then finally, we also looked very pragmatically at project pipeline and development site availability within the zones. We were already doing sort of point level data analysis of investment data to look at where existing investment, including public sector investment primarily, was going into the city. We had a collaborative process called developer services where we were engaging with and tracking real estate development projects in the pipeline. So we had some really specific, very targeted place-based data to understand where we might be able to move certain things along faster or move them up in the priority for investment if we were to designate those locations as opportunity zones.
Awesome. Thank you. And helpful to think through your heads and where they were back then. I want to bring us a little bit more to now, and if you can think if you were in your same seat and how it is that you're thinking about moving this forward. I want to talk about partnerships or models that might work locally or with state-local coordination, maybe some recommendations that around indicators that you didn't think through last time, but you do want to think through this time, and even process a bit in terms of community engagement. What does that look like? What should it look like? This is a very complicated tool to understand, and there's the nuance of you may want to go to this neighborhood, but if you pick it, that doesn't mean you're getting any money. So it's kind of a challenging thing to talk and work through. So if you could just help us think through, for those of us who are in cities now or counties or in state administrations, how do you think about partnerships? How do you think about criteria? How do you think about process and bringing people into that? So Sharon, yeah, thanks.
So, there's, of course, there's the data, there's the indicators, but a lot of people have either asked questions or mentioned the importance of local engagement. And so I'll talk about that a little bit. One thing that we did in DC that I think worked really well is that we identified a few clusters. We were able to designate 25 census tracts. And so we identified like 3 options. We published those maps and we put out a survey and we had conversations with the elected and advisory neighborhood commissioners who are, asked to weigh in on development matters in their jurisdictions. And I think that the process of giving people a sense of where could this be, what could this be, and also having opportunities to just talk about what it was helpful. And that was helpful at the community level in having conversations beyond opportunity zones. Like, the reality is this is just a piece of a much broader system in which we operate. Like, this investment happens all the time, and it's not happening under the auspice of opportunity zones. And so a lot of the conversations I ended up having were about things like, should an investor from out of state be able to invest on this block? What sorts of approvals should need to happen? And those were conversations that were, sort of beyond the incentive, but really about how do we create a policy environment that encourages development that truly benefits local communities. And the other benefit of publishing those maps and having some of those conversations is that we also got an understanding of what kinds of real projects might happen, because you don't want to waste a designation on something that's not actually going to help. So being able to get a sense of like what sorts of sponsors were out there, how people were thinking about things, that I think gives some opportunity to make sure that you're fully utilizing this tool to the extent that it can be helpful and aligned with public objectives.
I would certainly +1 on a lot of what Sharon said. I think I would very much still advocate for that approach of not reinventing the wheel. The opportunity zone tax incentive is not going to completely transform the availability and the terms of capital in such a way that you would need to throw out everything that a city has already planned for in terms of how your communities are going to grow and develop. And most cities, if not all, make those plans with a lot of input and community engagement through those processes. So I think seeing overlaying the OZ eligible census tracts across where you've already created those plans for growth and development, where you are already tracking information and data and engaging with community partners about the pipeline of projects in their areas that they want to see happen, is the right starting point. I'll note on the outreach and community engagement side, in terms of doing things specific to opportunity zones, I do feel like there's a lot of risk in communities being over surveyed and then still ending up being underinvested. I feel like that risk is particularly strong with this particular incentive, given the way that it is designed. So I would think carefully about doing something that's very specific to opportunity zones and community engagement in terms of how you're setting expectations, how you're going out to folks. And again, maybe encourage this discussion to be part of those broader engagements that places should be having anyway, and engaging with community development corporations and other local leaders, as well as elected officials representing those areas and neighborhoods within the city that are eligible for this investment, but that are also potentially able to benefit from other types of incentives and local tools that the city has available to offer. So those would be, I think, a couple of things. And then noting back, Brett, to the data that you just presented from the Ohio example, I don't know that we anticipated quite as much as we can now see that this investment would be so heavily concentrated in multifamily housing, and particularly in that market rate multifamily housing. So, in a time when we have a significant undersupply across the country in so many communities of housing in general, we absolutely have an undersupply of affordable housing specifically, and that's going to take some different tools, I think, to address, although maybe OZ can be part of it. But I think looking at maybe those areas within a city in the eligible census tracts that could be more likely to have some significant multifamily development, particularly if it's oriented around transit and accessible to job opportunities, that could be one thing to look at even more closely than perhaps we did the last time around.
Thanks. Yeah, a different way that I try to agree with all of that, and a different way I try to explain OZs for people who aren't familiar is just think of market rate investment and equity. It's an equity tool. Think about how equity is used in real estate investing at present. And then think, is it a zone? And maybe we can have somewhat of a preferential price or return from that. So we're really thinking of the normal, way that investment works in this country. There's not a fundamentally different system and process in play because we are OZ, which is not to in any way diminish the work that some of the socially motivated OZ investors that we've just heard from are doing their activities. But in terms of the preponderance of how OZ is working, and what that means from a city or county or local perspective is you're not in charge of the capital sources that are coming into your community. You may be in charge of the land use, but even that differs somewhat where in the country we're talking about. But this is not, capital sources are not typically something that a locality has any real influence in other than indirectly through some of the other means like zoning and permitting and those sorts of facets. So that's where cities will have to think. But we do have the opportunity for this selection moment, which is the interplay between a lot of these dynamics. Okay, where I want to go next is on balancing interests and maybe competing interests or needs or desires. OZs are something of this tightrope where we're trying to walk, not accelerating displacement in a community by building housing that is more expensive than what exists naturally occurring. On the other hand, this is the nation's largest economic development tool, maybe housing tool, right? Certainly, we don't want to pass federal subsidy by if they're willing to provide it, but we also could select a lot of zones that get nothing. And so just from the mind of local leaders, you've got real estate developers showing up in your offices telling you, I've got this property or I've got an eye on this property. Can you help me? Can we get this selected? That sort of thing is already going on. We've got community groups that are making a case for or against inclusion of specific zones. We've got housing advocates and others. We have city-owned property and land that maybe could get put into the private market. How do we weigh the trade-offs of these constituencies and their needs, and how do we think about that in light of what the OZ tool can and cannot accomplished, and how kind of practically and tangibly are we folding this in with the other kind of city plan or regional even plans that we might have to include for things like transit, which could be very linked to where it's attractive to build some real estate. Maybe Anne, we'll start with you and then go to Sharon on how we kind of hold these different elements together.
Absolutely. I think, just a +1 to how you just framed that, Brett, in terms of really integrating the existing plans that city already has around transit and transportation development, housing development, and other types of, economic and community development planning. So I would certainly say that, OZs becoming a piece of that rather than OZs as a driver for a totally new strategy is what I would encourage for communities to think about in terms of balancing those specific interests and perhaps sometimes, competing or differing interests. I think that, it's important for the city to look proactively at where it makes the most sense for this particular tool to come into play to support attracting additional capital. Again, maybe that's workforce housing projects that might have some challenging economics as costs have increased. And can the OZ incentive be enough to make something work that might otherwise not be viable in today's market? And where is that workforce housing through the existing plans and community interests that have already been expressed the most desired? That also, I think, would connect to transit-oriented development and bring those two things together. So I think there's a positive opportunity for cities to incentivize strategically the kinds of development that could most be beneficial or could most benefit from OZs, but also to think about the potential risks of that. And I think some of your data, especially in terms of the data that you showed from Ohio, where the median rents of the housing that was developed were the rents of the housing that was developed were above the median. And so thinking about what are the strategies in those communities around anti-displacement, and again, for the places that already have certain protections in place for longtime owner occupants, for example, about protecting them from rises in taxes or protections for renters, maybe thinking about how do you put some extra effort working with community partners to engage the residents in areas where those census tracts are going to be designated to ensure that those protections are really being taken advantage of by the existing residents or small business owners so that they can ideally benefit from the growth that will happen in that area and not risk displacement. So I would think about it maybe from both perspectives.
So I guess to add, because it's hard to disagree with anything Anne said, and I don't. So I'll try to add. So I think about what can this thing, like what can local government do to affect market activity, and also like how can this tool help local government more directly. And on the market side, I feel like the most important thing that local government can do is create a local policy environment that supports development that is both informed by and beneficial to the community. And, that is like when we were thinking about this in DC, we had a citywide inclusionary zoning policy. We had a tenant opportunity to purchase policy. We had a portion of housing stock subject to rent stabilization. We had a commercial retailer property tax credit. There were a lot of things in place that sort of like applied already to development. We had just gone through a comp plan update. And so for places that don't have those things in place, think about them. If I was a governor, I would be requiring that any community that was asking for a designation have an anti-displacement plan in place, or are thinking about, some of the harassment or pressure that property owners can feel from investor activity broadly. That said, you also really need to understand your local market dynamics. Not every place is a high cost market, right? And so if the conditions merit it, yeah, think about your boosters. And but I don't think that a local government should be held responsible for making this federal incentive a good community development policy broadly. Like there's a huge gap between what good community economic development policy would be and what the reality of this tool is. And so I think that being able to focus on the regulatory environment broadly, and if you own assets, like how can you utilize those, local government, to make sure that you're taking advantage of this opportunity to advance projects that could really help. So if you don't already know what you own, you should do an analysis pretty quickly. If you don't know what to prioritize for development to align with local priorities, I would suggest that'd be step 2.
I'll
part
just
of
plus one
Please.
on the publicly owned properties and sites. I think especially in the housing space, since we know that multifamily housing is a huge need across the country, just in terms of more overall supply, and looking very strategically at maybe not just what the city government owns, but taking a more broad look. We've watched in Atlanta how the mayor of Atlanta has put together his housing strike force that includes not just, the city government, but is looking at what does the school district own? What does the transit authority own? What does the housing authority own? And really pooling together all of those public assets to say what property can be revitalized that's not needed for those other purposes any longer to support the housing needs in the city. So I think this is a great opportunity for more folks to take that type of strategic approach and look holistically at what not just city government but the public sector as a whole owns and align it to the tract eligibility.
Part of what I wanted you all on the webinar, thank you for those who are hanging with us, to hear from our social-minded investors, and then also from our city leaders, was really the balance of what could be done under this program that might help in your place, as well as what constraints and pressures and opportunities that you have in a local area. I think there's been a tendency maybe in more progressive places to say, listen, this policy the first time around wasn't passed with any Democratic votes. It wasn't, in the next time around. It's mostly incentive for highly wealthy people and institutions to do things to us, not for us, that we didn't ask for, we didn't approve of, and are leading to investment that is not even what we want to see in our communities. That may be true, and yet it's a tool that's available, and my encouragement is for everyone to think carefully around what zones they want selected in their communities, which ones they don't want selected in their communities. And this has been dormant from the policy perspective in a while, because we selected zones and then some rules were written and investors went and did their things. But now really is the moment where state and local officials and NGOs and those that are influential in the process can really come back in and say, okay, we've learned from the past, we're aware of what we want to see in our communities, and here's what we're going to advocate for. So I'm collectively asking folks to dust off some of their perhaps lack of enthusiasm for the way the incentive is designed globally, and still to care about how it's going to land in their place and how they're wanting it to show up as maximally they can influence, which is still minimally, but that is through the zone selection process. So that's my plug, that's my pitch for those of you who are with us. Okay, I want to end with one more question for our two panelists here, and I want to talk a little bit about politics, especially the kind of city to state or NGO to the selection entity device, and just it'd be very easy for governors or DC mayors. Obviously, we've got territories as well that are doing selections. To make the pick that they want, but this is a repeated game theory scenario, right? The relationships between cities, counties, states, et cetera. And so I'd just like to talk a little bit about the politics of this and what you recommend have found to be effective communication strategies in terms of people who are trying to influence for social benefit or good, a tract being included as a zone, and what you think is helpful there, and what the people on our call should try to keep in mind as they're, for those who aren't making the selection themselves, what they need to try to advance forward. Who wants to start?
Happy to start. So I don't think that my advice here is going to be specific to opportunity zones, but I always like to start with incentives, like what's motivating people. And so, step one is understand your audience. Who are the decision makers? Who's going to influence the decision makers? How can you speak to their priorities? I've also rarely come across a public official who doesn't want to see like a real project happen. Like everyone loves a ribbon cutting or a groundbreaking, not because necessarily of the photo op, but because that means like real things are starting to happen in ways that are tangible for people. So having real options is great. And then third is, leverage your partners. There are many others who will have a vested interest in those selections. And so it doesn't need to be the local government leader necessarily making their case. This is when you should be really leveraging others whose interests are aligned.
Sharon, I love your point about the tangible projects. I think that that's a really good one in terms of making the case for why the tracks that you're recommending for selection will would make a good fit to the state. The other thing that I would say, and this was based on our experience in Philadelphia, there was a very strong, collaborative working relationship between the mayor's office at the time and the governor's office at the time. Both of those have turned over, so I'm not sure how how much institutional memory is left on that front. But one of the things that we did from the local level was really to try to make the case that because of the amount of eligible census tracts that were located in Philadelphia relative to the rest of the state. There's a lot of distressed communities in the city. We made a strong case that this incentive, such as it is, should disproportionately, to some degree, benefit Philadelphia because we had much higher poverty and lower income levels than other parts of the state. At the same time, I think we did pretty well in making that case and getting at least our fair share. But at the same time, the governors are balancing the entire state and making sure that there was some level of representation in, let's say, every county might be something that's important to governors. And so I think understanding that there's going to be some give and take and that you're not likely to get everything that's on your list, and being able to not only select a set of priority tracks, but to then be able to prioritize within those that you're recommending and be able to do that quickly, because there was definitely some, very quick turnaround and very quick back and forth that happened, particularly towards the end of the process, I think is something else that I would recommend just from a practical perspective.
Thank you. I want to end by underscoring the quick part. Now is the time. Pre-selections are being made, and so really this is not something that can wait. So thank you all for joining. Thank you for your questions. We'll try to follow up with some of those specific ones that we didn't get to yet. I'm sure all of our speakers would love to be in touch with you, so you can be in touch with them directly if you have more questions. Thank you to our investor panel. Thank you to moderators, presenters, and you all at the City Perspective. Super appreciate the time and insights. Take care.
Thanks, Brett.